Given that you've told me that the problem is we don't think about it right, we don't have the right story, we don't act right, and our structures don't work properly, and all those things, by the way, all depend on each other. I can see why you might get a bit bummed out by that.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, the other way to see it is that, as you just said, they're all linked up. So, any entry point, in a sense, can do, especially if you're holding the whole in mind.
I am a miserable bastard. I say I care about climate change and I do all sorts of unspeakable things. Sometimes I drive a car. I do not always wash my clothes at 30 degrees, and I have more than once been in an aeroplane. This is Your Brain on Climate, and we are talking about how come all of us, even me, can be absolute hypocrites on climate change, and why, despite the stuff you might be told, it's a little bit more complicated than us all just being bastards. I'm talking in this episode to Dr. Gail Hochachka, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Gail has got an amazing bit of thinking about this thing called the values action gap. You might have heard it talked about. It's basically what I talked about at the start there. We care about stuff, we care about climate and other things, but we don't act in a way that feels like it or that seems like it to other people. Our actions are out of kilter with our values. And different people have different sorts of analysis for that. Some people say it's because of the system that locks us in and we need to smash the system. Other people say it's because we haven't got the story right. Still other people will say the problem is it's our inner worlds and our own sense of motivation. Well, Gail stitched it all together. Gail says the best way to think about the values action gap is a vicious circle, if you like, of systems that control how we can act, but also stories and narratives that come from our deepest emotions and thoughts about the world, which are in turn controlled by those systems. And the idea you can just pull one lever to fix it all, that we can behaviour change our way out of this, or we can system change our way out of this without attending to any of the other stuff, is wrong. It's about our inner brains, the society, the collective spaces that we have, and the structures that surround and create and enable those spaces. And if that sounds complicated, well, Gail's going to make it sound less complicated. But actually what it is more than anything else is a source of incredible optimism, because it goes to show how fast all of these things can tip. As always, if you hear this noise, it denotes wisdom, and there is wisdom, almost all of it, from Gail. It means there's a little link in the show notes to something that we've talked about, so you don't need to worry about stopping it. You can just listen to the podcast and then go back and check the show notes at your leisure for more info. And as always, a huge thank you to everyone who sponsors me on patreon.com/yourbrainonclimate. It means the world to me. It means I can afford to pay my guests, which is really important. Too much of podcasting is about extracting people's time and not paying for it. I think it's really important to respect and reward the time of the people that come on. So that's almost entirely where your money goes. The rest of it goes for like the website and stuff like that and the hosting. Couldn't do this without you. Please do consider chucking in the price of a cup of tea every month if you fancy it. Go to that link, patreon.com/yourbrainonclimate. And if you can't or won't, or you want to do something else, do that. Then it would be wonderful if you could pop to your local podcast medium of choice, ideally iTunes, something like that, and leave me a 5-star review and write something with your hands, because that pushes it up the charts and gets me more coverage and all good stuff.
Your brain on climate.
So we're going to talk about how everybody says they care about climate change, but no one bloody well behaves like it. That's what we're going to talk about. And I know that that definitely applies to me. Would you say that applies to you as well?
Yeah, I would say that that can apply to me in various moments for various reasons, but yes.
Are there any, do you catch yourself ever doing something when you're like, oh, come on, I'm supposed to be a studied expert and a moral leader on this stuff, and here I am squashing an otter into the ground with my foot or something? Do you ever catch yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. The funniest one, last summer, we had experienced here on the west coast of Canada, we'd experienced a really bad heat dome the year before that just was very intense. And so between that time and last summer, I got a bunny rabbit. that lives in our apartment. And we're on the top floor of a low rise. And so our floor and our unit, which is south facing, gets a ton of sun. And I was concerned about my bunny. Like, my daughter and I can kind of get by, but the bunny is a different matter because he's covered in
hang on, wait a minute. Wait. Now, your brain on climate does not want to hear about bunny trauma. Tell me this worked out all right.
I know. My poor bunny, traumatized by the heat dome. So I find myself buying a portable AC unit with all this incredible chagrin. Like, how could I be the climate scholar and activist buying the AC unit for my bunny rabbit? But it really brought me to consider how the most vulnerable little being in our setup was my tiniest little bunny rabbit, and I had to do something. So anyway, this was one of those instances where my climate concern dropped out in regards to my action.
Now, listen, I think everybody will cut you a break for looking after the bunny. What sort of a world is it if we're not allowed to look after our animals? Last summer, when it got really hot over here, I made a tuna fish ice lolly for my cat, and I tried to feed it to her, and she wouldn't have it. She thought it was the worst thing in the world, but it was the thought that counts, right?
That is hilarious.
So, I mean, I guess that's a sort of, that's a small example of the fact that actually even the best of us, right? I've had people on here. I remember talking to that Lorraine Whitmarsh a few episodes ago, who's an expert on like behavior change. She's talking about all the things when she just beats herself up every day, like when she has a cheese sandwich and she knows she shouldn't have cheese. But we do that, don't we? Like those of us who are green-minded, we really like to beat ourselves up about this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Have you found anything in your work that kind of, I don't know, before we get into the details of it, that should give us all reason to cut ourselves a bit of a break and be nice to ourselves a bit?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you start with these questions about our own personal difficulties with this, because they say that you end up researching that which you can't solve in your own existence, right? And maybe in some ways that has been my persistent puzzle that I can't quite work out in my own case, nor in what I've experienced around me. But it appears that there are so many things that press down on us as we try to move our climate concern into action. And I spent not just the past coming up on 8 years studying this in the capacity of research, but that builds on, a career in working in sustainable development where just the complexities of collective action problems have really puzzled me. And so, I would say it's been, a red thread through my career, both practically and also in a research setting.
And do you feel that you are getting there? Have you edged towards some sort of holistic understanding?
Well, I would say that yes. And there's sort of interesting kind of field notes along the way that I'm really ecstatic to share on your podcast with you. This is one of my favorite podcasts, just as a little side note.
Thanks.
But yeah, it seems that there's a few things. And one of them, I just wanted to start with this puzzle around climate change being a collective action issue. And so there's a tension in that between individuals and like structures or like systems that we are in a sense locked into. And so that's one of the first tensions that needs to sort of be considered. And even in our first conversation about our pets, for example, that tension is present. Like, what can we do individually and what do we have access to sort of structurally or systemically are essentially different. So, our low-rise condo that we're in doesn't have AC. There's all these other factors about how the building itself nudges me to consider a portable AC unit for my bunny rabbit. So in a sense, my choices are already structured, and I'm locked into a certain set and locked out of others. And so that's individual systems kind of tension is one that we need to resolve. And many people, as you probably know from your podcast and from your own work, many people see climate to just be a systems issue. And they don't want to collapse it into it being about individuals. And that does make sense. Because as soon as we talk about it being, from the perspective of individuals, then we might forget all these other political, systemic, economic aspects that are really important.
Greenhouse gases trap heat inside the atmosphere, and that's overheating the planet. So if you want to work out your own carbon footprint, you need to know the amount of greenhouse gases, like carbon dioxide, you're responsible for creating. It's a difficult...
Yeah, we do kind of hear about that. So like an example is the carbon footprint idea, right? The idea that we are told we've all got our own share of the problem that we are causing, and it's our job as individuals to kind of reduce it. And you hear other people going, no, hang on a minute, that's bollocks, that is, because not just for reasons, our bunny rabbit we have to look after in our own way, but so much of the life that we all lead is tied up in choices we can't do anything about. Right, like kind of, whether we can get the bus to work or we have to drive or things like that.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's really good reason to stay attentive to these structural aspects. But the problem is if we don't include individuals, what we also don't pay attention to are all the sort of psychological and social aspects that are essentially housed within individuals. And so that's been my attempt to bring those two together. And when you do that, there's, humans, we have our own subjectivity, our own individual interior, but we also are immediately, inherently, and always social, right? So there's these two aspects of the interior of humans. One is individual, one is collective. And so this brings me to my four quadrant model that I know you've read about, and we're sort of
I have read about it, and we're going to do this. But I think in a nutshell, it's a really lovely thing. So I read your paper about a month or so ago and got you to come on and interviewed you on my podcast, and then we had to stop, and so we've started again. Just so as you know, little peek for everyone. This is the second time we've recorded this episode due to technical issues at my end. But what I loved about your model was it does combine. It doesn't say it's big systemic stuff or individual action, and that's it, and there's nothing in the middle. And it doesn't say, that it's all kind of outside us or all inside us. It basically says it's all those things. And that's what I love about it. And you've got this really nice way of kind of starting with our brains, that's what this podcast is about, and how we see the world and our place in it, and going all the way to like the structures that guide society and enabling us to see our way through that. So it's big and it's complicated, and we're going to try and take it in bits. So let's start with quadrant one. Start with the how we think about climate change in the world bit.
Sure, I sure will. So climate change is so fascinating to me because it's so complex. And so you take this, what's been considered a hyperobject by some, so something that's so vast in time and space that our minds really struggle to conceive of it. So essentially,
let's just spend a second on that before we move off it, because I love this idea of the hyperobjects, this thing that we just cannot get our head around, right? It's like trying to eat the whole of the moon in one go, or even kind of conceive of the whole universe. And the only way that we can do it is to approach it a bit at a time, or with the bit of it that we can see.
Yeah, exactly. It's not like your other typical environmental problems, say like the polluted stream at in our neighborhood, because that we can see, we can touch, we can actually use our senses to understand. But with climate change, it's massively distributed across space and time. We don't ever directly experience it. We rely on our sense extensions. So, other people's measurements of CO2 in the atmosphere and vast trends in weather patterns across time. These are not regular. Like most people can barely get through a week. We might plan 2 years out, but even that is a stretch. We don't think in the timelines that climate change operates in. So what invariably happens is that we catch whatever fragment of that whole that we can make meaning around. And what happens is we actually do build out a mental model. Like you've interviewed some fascinating researchers and scholars and practitioners in this area that will speak to this. So we have our own meaning making on climate. And what's interesting here is that we then forget that other people are doing the same. So problem one with this is that we've only caught a fragment. Problem two, we kind of don't realize everybody else is talking out of their own fragment. So it's hard to come to a shared meaning on what climate change even is from the get-go. So there's both there's both individually things going on there and also socially, but we'll wait to get to that.
Yeah. So let's have a couple of examples then. Can we, I know you've got several in your paper, but what are some of the different ways that different people basically understand what this thing called climate change is?
So climate scientists will pull their hair out when folks interpret climate change as weather. And it's an understandable frustration. And yet when you see it with an understanding of developmental psychology, which explains to us this mechanism for how people are making meaning, organizing meaning, it actually makes sense because weather is concrete. You can feel raindrops on your neck or the heat on your skin, or the immediate effects of weather are palpable and concrete, and that's an easier way to make meaning of something. So that would be one really common example. Climate change requires an abstract understanding, a subtle perception, to talk about GHG emissions and parts per million. I mean, these are complex, abstract concepts that are a different form of meaning making. So that's a really one kind of example. There are others that we could get into, but that would be one that I would point to because you'll hear it quite frequently.
But I think another one that is really good, and I guess maybe where I come in at it a bit, is for other people, it's a bit of a less spiritual thing. So some people experience climate change almost as a spiritual kind of crisis, right? To them, their story is of kind of almost like a falling out of a relationship with a higher being or something like that. And that's I guess your point is neither of those are wrong. They're just completely different kind of, not only ideas about climate, but kind of therefore, so what do you do about it type ideas about climate, right?
Yeah, I mean, the one that you were just pointing to is more faith-based, I would say, of there's a higher power. We, that entity is taking care of this. We don't need to do anything about it. And yes, that is present and that does exist in terms of that's one of the fragments of meaning making that can be found. What's interesting, and maybe as a parenthesis that we could pick up later, is that we have found, and I'm in the midst of writing up this research, we have found that some of the more complex ways of making meaning about climate change brings spirituality back in, but it brings it back in a different way, quite a different way. If you think about it, the very complexity of climate change that we started our conversation discussing, for us to be in relationship to that has the potential to evolve our way of being, our ways of thinking, our ways of relating, such that climate change itself is an invitation into higher human potential. The ways that these more complex meaning-making phrases sound are things like, climate change can provide us, ways to, let me think here. What are some examples? An opportunity to grow as human beings, a way to reach higher potentials, a part of our spiritual evolution. Very, very different ways of making meaning that you'll find in some of the academic, scientific communities, and definitely different meaning making that you would find in sort of more faith-based religious contexts.
We'll have you on that, come back and talk on that again. And I suppose that's different again to people who see it as just a technological thing, and other people who see it as fundamentally about economic systems gone wrong. And all of these ideas, I guess, are different. And within all of those ideas, we've got a different sense of our own ability to change it, right?
Yes, exactly. I mean, in a sense, one of my one of my key points with this notion of meaning making about climate change is that any of these ways that we wrap meaning around this issue could be a way into enacting actions. So, and that's what I think sometimes we sort of assume as climate protagonists, let's say, we can assume that there's only one way in. And so that's where we get those folks that are really keen on decarbonization technologies, or climate science itself, like we'll kind of drive toward those as the access point to shifting the dial on emissions and to getting climate action in place. But actually, another way to see it is that there's portals for climate action across all these ways of making meaning. And we kind of you have to let go of your own preference or your own, I think it would be great to decarbonize this way, but if somebody else sees that that they have a different in, let's make space for that portal in. So this is one of the suggestions that comes out of my research is that there are a multiplicity of ways to go about this. So the other pieces of this first quadrant, the upper left quadrant, is our emotions, which are critical to the climate challenge and somehow are not making it into how we craft climate policy. And this may touch on various aspects here, some of what we just said previously about our pets even. But how our feelings factor into this is key. And it's key in a few different ways. And we don't dig into the details maybe right away, but I just wanted to see this piece, which is that because climate raises strong emotions, difficult emotions, challenging emotions, some of those emotions are hard to actually allow ourselves to feel. And so what I brought in to this research is a psychological phenomenon called shadow, where when there's something that comes up for us emotionally that is hard to be with, there can be a way that we push it out of the light of our consciousness into shadow. And so there's a number of scholars that have written on this in fascinating ways, where people will say, we just need to protect ourselves a little bit. We don't want to think about that. And they'll actually describe that function of making shadow what is too uncomfortable to be with regarding climate change. And so that left unaccounted for, things that we place into shadow, left unaccounted for, become open to possibly malicious actors. They're available to other sorts of misinformation narratives. And it becomes a factor that I believe we need to account better for in terms of understanding climate action.
So do you mean something like shame? Like we might feel ashamed of the fact that we care about the future of the planet. It upsets us, but yet we feel sort of locked in to not being able to do anything about it. Yeah,
exactly. Shame, helplessness, that same, getting right back to what I said about individual versus systems. The system is so heavy and so impossible. We feel helpless to do anything about it. And then the shame as a result of that. A big one that I'm sure you see in the UK as much as we see in Canada is a sense of being powered over and being powerless. Yeah. And so that's that frustration with climate regulations in large part has to do with this like frustration of being powered over. And so just the frustration around that, or the not wanting to feel powerless. And so that whole set of feelings will be placed in shadow and become then, a space where other, like I said, people can become more open to other misinformation frames as a result of managing those shadowed emotions.
And this is still at the kind of internal world level that we've got the, our own feelings and values about climate change, which as we've established might be different and be different places. But then if we if we're sort of suppressing them actually in practice and putting them in the background and ignoring them, that could be a really big problem.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And this, I mean, in a way, this starts to touch into the other quadrants. I wonder if is this a good time to shift to one of the other quadrants?
Yeah, please do. Yeah. Go for
it. So the one that this relates with, I mean, it relates to all of them, but as I'm describing this, you can see how it relates with the fact that we are relational beings. Every human immediately as a baby is dependent on our families, right? And so from day one, before day one, we are related and relational beings. And so that's the case with this as well, is that we find ourselves drawn into certain, what I've called climate change discourses that relate with our meanings about climate, and in some ways relate to that climate shadow, that it relates to some extent with where we feel sort of socially comfortable, if you will. And so this narrative dimension is incredibly important. And so this is what I would call the lower left quadrant, or the interior of the collective, culture by any other name.
Culture, right. So let's have an example of that. Like in your life, how do you find that playing out?
Oh, okay. Well, yes. How do I find this playing out? I mean, I would say that I'm a bit of a funny character because I geek out on this a lot. So I'm noticing, the subcultures I participate in, the echo chambers I'm part of. So I have a bit of meta awareness on the subcultures I'm part of. But I would say that at the university, I'm part of one, which is, fairly progressive, fairly pro-climate, and then I'll find myself in other spaces, largely because I seek them out. I seek out counter views to my own. And especially amongst people that are what I would call like just, workers, people that are concerned about their job and their livelihood and are sitting with very genuine concern about what climate change means and what climate action means for their futures from the perspective of livelihood. And I'm just really interested to see that they're in a different climate change discourse. And theirs lends itself more to it leans more towards climate denial. And this is where it gets back to those emotions, right? Right. Because if you're facing not just the potential loss of your livelihood, but a question as to what your identity, like who you are in your identity, there is good reason to shadow those feelings, make that climate shadow, and then seek out climate change discourses that make you feel quite a bit better. A discourse that says, climate change isn't really real, or, we haven't thrown all the tech we could possibly throw at it. Like, this isn't as big of a problem as they say it is. That might be a more comfortable place to hang out.
Yeah, at a more basic level, it will be all right. I can't really believe that it won't be all right. And I think the important thing is, like, we all do that, right? We all definitely care about climate, but kind of one of the reasons we live as if we don't is because we're kind of surrounded by a normal that says we don't have to. Yeah. And we all make that normal happen. We don't like to think that we are bad people, and nor does anyone else. And so we all kind of construct this story of it'll be all right. It's not actually that big a problem, and I can still carry on flying around the world or whatever we do. Right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's a key thing with anything I'm talking about here is that all of these are really normal, natural human functions, including that shadow piece, and we're all doing that at any point. So, and I think that that's the other part here is that if we can't proceed from connection and empathy, then our climate engagement is kind of deficient. It's anemic. If we're proceeding from our minds and, cognitive facts and information, but missing the sort of the human element, then we're not able to really kind of get where people are coming from, let alone meet them where they're at. And so I'm all about that kind of deep engagement or empathetic engagement in terms of climate action, which I don't think we've done yet in a way that will really hopefully move the dial on this problem.
Well, certainly not, I think, when it comes to judging other people and thinking that person is bad, look at that person driving their massive car, what a bastard, right? And firstly, you're assuming that they think about the world the same way that you do, but even it's perfectly conceivable that they do, but for all sorts of reasons have completely rationalized that that's an all right thing to do, or they might need to, or whatever. And I think we rush to judge other people, but we don't always apply that to ourselves, do we?
Yeah, no, that's exactly true. And if you just take that one example of the car, this is a great place to see the values action gap playing out. And this, I don't think we've mentioned the values action gap yet in detail, but this idea that we may value action on climate and we may be concerned about climate change, but we go to move into action and something falls out and we don't manage to connect those two. And so when it comes to driving, the choice of car you drive, for example, there can be any number of reasons you go for the car you go for. Some people may choose an EV because of climate change. They don't want to, contribute to fossil fuel emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. But for others, they drive an EV because it is quicker. It actually drives faster, and they like that. Totally different set of values, totally different meaning making, right? A different set of emotions that brings up. And then, there's other people that might drive a clunker, an old fossil fuel 20-year-old car because one, they can't afford a nicer car, or two, they want to drive that thing to the ground and not, invest in another fancy EV that has used all these carbon emissions, even to put it on the road. There's a whole bunch of reasons going on there that are fascinating.
Or they might think, like, I'm all up for getting an EV in theory, but I don't think the technology's ready yet, or I can't trust it, or it's not reliable. And we see a lot of this at the moment with where I think electric car sales are, where particularly here in the UK, there's a bit of a sense of like, the people who are going to get one because they like it have got one, and everyone else is a bit of a, I'm not sure it's ready yet thing going on. But so that's, again, it's perfectly possible to go, I like them in principle. I'm all up for climate action. I think they're part of the answer, but I haven't got one yet because I'm not ready.
And there's another group that says, and this gets to that notion of don't regulate me and the feelings around being powered over, is that I've heard increasingly a narrative around not wanting a full EV because then the government might just turn off electricity or like regulate electricity and they would feel helpless. So those folks talk about, I'm fine with a hybrid, but I'm not going to go for EV until I have some confirmation that this is an ploy to regulate me better. So I've heard that, and that gets back to those climate change discourses. That is a denial, that's a more of a denial frame, a dismissive climate change discourse.
Your brain on climate.
So let's dive into the third quadrant.
Oh, yes, please.
Yeah, and this one is where we actually spend a lot of our time as climate protagonists, which is climate action. So the actual exterior behaviors that we would need to take up to carry out climate action. And this also includes things, technologies that we would put in place to support those behaviors, or policy tools like ways we would manage people's behaviors to nudge them in a certain direction. And so when we talk about climate action, that's largely what we're speaking about. And yeah, so this is an incredibly important quadrant, and it's actually in my heuristic really only 1/4 of the full holistic way to approach this topic.
Interesting. So you're saying the bit that I think when people think values action gap, the bit where they think the problem is, which is what the action is, you're saying that's important, but it's only 1/4 of the thing that's going on here.
Well, exactly. And so people will throw their head against the wall with behavior change because it's so hard to activate or have happen. And big reasons why is that you can't just flip a switch on your behaviors. I mean, you and I both know that based on our first conversation about our pets. There's a lot more going into why and how we take up the actions we take up and why we change our behaviors or not. And so, so this is one other reason that I say that climate change isn't a tech issue, or it isn't a techno-managerial issue. Techno on the technology side, managerial on the policy side. It can't be just seen as that, or in other words, we have seen it as that. And I would submit to you that's one reason why we still struggle on implementing what are excellent climate action plans. Because as soon as they start to get rolled out, they come up on all these human dimensions that somehow obfuscate and kind of stall out what are great climate action plans.
And is that primarily a structural thing? So the reason people don't take action is because it doesn't work for them practically? Or are you talking more here about people just don't want to do that thing? It doesn't fit with their identity. It's not the sort of thing people like them do, or what?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and that's really why I've sought these 4 quadrants as a transdisciplinary way to understand that very issue. And so we've gone over meaning making of emotions and how the notion of shadowing certain difficult ones. We've gone over sort of the narrative spaces we inhabit, and then the piece that you're bringing in is the structural one, and that is the 4th quadrant, essentially, of we live in systems that lock us into and shape what choices we even have in the first place. And so this kind of gets back to what we touched on at the early part of our conversation already around, when you are seeking to get to work in the morning, is there a viable transit system you could use? If there simply isn't, and your choices are primarily car-based, you're likely going to choose your car, even if you wouldn't want to choose your car, regardless of what you value. Structurally, those are the choices you have in front of you.
Which then plays out in loads of other ways. So like if you've got a car, you will then, when you move house, you will move further away from a transit system because you don't need the transit system, which means you then have to keep on using your car, repeat, right? Yeah,
repeat, rinse and repeat, yes. So there's a way that systems quadrant, which is the 4th quadrant, has been considered, and this is going from like Karl Marx all the way through to the theorists that I...
Oh, Marx, lovely, bring it. Yeah, very good.
Is these systems that we're in are the heaviest. I mean, Marx went as far as to say our means of production determine our consciousness, and I don't agree, but they do relate with our consciousness in a very, very strong way. And so that systems quadrant, I mean, that's one big reason that climate actors focus as much as we do on actions and systems, especially systems, because they're so heavy. But they're not everything. So that's kind of the good news and the bad news. They're a substantial piece to this puzzle, but they're not all of it.
So the people who say all we've got to do is change the system, you would argue are missing a bit, which is that those systems exist in large part because of the way that we think and feel about the world. They don't you have to do all of it. You can't, there's a sort of virtuous circle or vicious circle where the systems reflect our values, which shape the systems that we live in. And so you can't just go in at any one of those things. You have to kind of tackle it all.
Exactly. And that's what I say about we haven't yet used our whole toolkit, and why we need a holistic or transdisciplinary approach to this, because they are all co-arising. So that, who makes the system? The very consciousness that is, enacted through our hearts and minds as people. And yet then it becomes externalized and heavy and big, and then we think, oh, we can't get at that, but we can. We created the thing.
About the changes happening in Paris. Mayor Anne Hidalgo has become famous for her initiatives to reduce car use in Paris and provide more space for walking, cycling, and public transit, especially cycling. Recently, the Paris government has announced they plan to make the city 100% cyclable by 2026, which would be an incredibly fast transition.
That's why we have amazing city, for example, at the scale of cities, we have amazing climate action plans which are changing the structures of our cities. to actually provide you options when you're trying to get to work in the morning, so that you have any number of ways to get there, not just the car, right?
So, okay, this is good that you're saying this, because I was just about to say, oh my God, what the hell do we do with this if what we're trying to do is change human consciousness and the way the whole system works? But it sounds like what you're saying is, no, wait a minute, look at it the other way around, that this is all linked up. So if you do manage to change one bit of it, you're going to start changing the rest of it as well.
Yeah. That's a nice way to say it. Yeah, it's all linked up. And so, people do ask me why it is I have the optimism that I have. And I've had to really sit with why, because one would think I don't have that optimism, given, as any climate researcher, we spend a lot of time looking at some pretty dire data.
Well, given that you've told me that the problem is we don't think about it right, we don't have the right story, we don't act right, and our structures don't work properly, and all those things, by the way, all depend on each other. I can see why you might get a bit bummed out by that.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, the other way to see it is that, as you just said, they're all linked up. So, any entry point, in a sense, can do, especially if you're holding the whole in mind.
And I think people have asked me about my optimism. I mean, I vary on my level of optimism. But when I have it, I think it's exactly that thing of, this could all cascade really quick.
Yeah.
Like humans are capable of changing their mind on a grand scale about stuff really fast all the time, often with devastating consequences. Often, you look at fascism and kind of how quickly societies can kind of swing behind that and stuff like that, but often in brilliant ways as well. Look at sort of the rise of movements that like Black Lives Matter movement, which in the space of a very short space of time went from a thing that was massively important but wasn't a global phenomenon to being a global phenomenon. And these ideas can ripple and they can change systems, and you can start to see it happening in like how advertising works in that example of like, the representation of different people on screen, which then starts to change all sorts of other stuff. But what do you think, any of us at the same time, like what's the best way for all of us in our lives to kind of try and navigate that? Like how do you hold that bigness?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great, I'm so glad you're getting to this, because these what I think of as tipping points, social tipping points, are fascinating. And so there's a few things I want to say about this. One is that if we see climate change as a technical problem, we're missing the opportunity for social tipping points, because we're focusing just on decarbonization technology, right? So what we find, and I'm sure you have lots of examples of this in the UK, as I have in Canada, and which exist around the world as well, is when we have a government putting forth a really great climate policy, and it's met with backlash, instead of having society kind of get behind it. So when government takes a climate action plan and proceeds via political mandate only, and we forget that it missed the social mandate that's to back it, we find that what could have been a social tipping point kind of ends up being a social stalling point. And that puzzle is one that I'm really focusing on in my research. So yeah, it's something that I think about a lot. And I don't have entirely a full answer, but I do think it comes down to, one, thinking of it as more than a tech problem. This is a transdisciplinary problem that is really more about transformation. And that's why it's so hard, because we're talking about changes in identity, changes in behavior, changes in culture, changes in the system, so that's transformation. So, but just to bring it back to this notion of tipping points or these norm cascades, when we look at how that works, and there's a lot of interesting research there as to, what percentage of the population is needed for that to then start to cascade. And it isn't a huge amount. It isn't like it has to get to 90% before it happens. It's actually more like 20 or 10. It's actually not a very big percentage. But when enough start holding a different set of norms, then that cascade can start to shift. And so that's
depending, sorry to interrupt you, but presumably depending also on those other bits of the quadrant. So one of the extent to which a norm can spread will depend on the story that we're telling and the structures that we have around us and all of these other things. So your point being, if I think I've understood it, that all of this stuff has to be thought of in totality. You can't just try and change a story without caring about how people feel about the world right now and their place in it, for example.
Yes, exactly. And what's somewhat unfortunately, like this is, I don't mean to be the bringer of bad news, but definitely since the pandemic, which COVID was another collective action problem, akin to climate change. Like we couldn't address it individually. We couldn't address it just as one nation. It had to be a global initiative. And so it's the other thing that's happened that society has experienced, and their experience of it was not that great. And so what happened in Canada in any case is that at the very time that we need social cohesion, we got social fragmentation. And so the polarization, at least in Canada, it has increased since, I would say, around 2021, 2022, dramatically, and along the lines of what you would expect to see in the States. So that's a concern to me, and we're tracking it really carefully. But the way that climate change has been communicated, largely by myself and my colleagues, I'll admit, we've been too stuck in a bubble that left out regular people. And those folks have been, in a sense, because they've been left out, they've been drawn into other narrative frames that have then become polarized. So that's one way to say it. Another way to say it is that climate change was pulled into the culture war. Yeah. But what we see is a socially fragmented landscape or a polarized landscape. And so that makes social tipping points even harder to get at. It's kind of, we're kind of behind the problem now and have to work first on resolving the polarization before we can then get further into what it is we'd like to see for climate.
It's a really good lens, though, I think, that you're putting on disinformation and polarization, which is often, I think, and you get this certainly a lot in my world, people describe it as a problem of there are bad actors who are giving bad information to people who don't know any better, right? Ill-informed people. And they are bastards and that has to be stopped. But it sounds like what you're saying is, but hang on, it's those of us who are talking about climate change need to take seriously the emotions and the worldviews and the lives of people who don't think like us and connect with those people in a meaningful way. And if we're failing to do that, well, of course, there's a vacuum created into which people who are better at that than we are going to flood.
Exactly. So I found this quote just the other day, and it's the first time I'd really seen the polarization happening in Canada that proceeded from the pandemic be seen through the lens of climate. And this quote is, "The price of constantly talking to ourselves inside our bubble left a big chunk of the Canadian population outside the climate conversation and ready to be welcomed anywhere or elsewhere." So that's, in a way, what I like about that understanding of it is that it kind of points the finger back at how we've communicated about climate change, and therefore we can do something about it. Like we can open up, get past our bubbles, and really connect more with the daily lived realities of just regular people. What do they value? What are their genuine concerns? How can we connect our climate communications and engagement and climate action better with those lived realities? And so that's what my research is pointing to and trying to get at.
Gail, thank you so much for coming on Your Brain on Climate. Thank you so much for coming on Your Brain on Climate twice. This is the second time we've tried to record this episode, and your patience is legendary. Thank you so much. Look, how can people get in touch with you, find out more about your work, read your papers, that sort of stuff?
Oh, yeah, thank you. Well, it has been so wonderful to be here. I absolutely love your podcast. When I first found it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is a podcast I've been waiting for. So very sincere thanks on my side. I have a few ways you can get in touch with me or my work. I will send you maybe my website, which would be the easiest place. I try and link to my publications so you can see that. And then one of my colleagues and I are moving research into practice across this year with a project called SALT for Climate. And the idea with SALT, it's an acronym for Sense Making, Action, Leadership, and Training. But the idea with SALT is that when we engage these deeper human dimensions, it's a bit like adding salt to a meal. You never eat a plate of salt, you sprinkle salt on your cuisine and it lights it up. It catalyzes what's already there. And so this way of working with the human dimensions, we see that in the same way. It can serve to catalyze the existing technologies and actions and plans we have in place for climate. So I would be happy to share that website as well. And you can see different sorts of engagement opportunities that we have here in Canada for that.
That felt like one of those conversations that was the tip of several icebergs all at once. I think Gail did a brilliant job of knitting it all together. I really recommend checking out her paper, which is very accessible as academic papers go. And I think there's something so important in there about, look, any one of the things that people think is the problem, but that's not all it is. Everything is always more complicated. But as I said at the start, I don't think that has to be a bad thing. I think actually it shows how quick we can cascade stuff, make a bit of a system change tweak, and suddenly the stories that we allow ourselves to say in public might change, or the other way around. All of these things are connected, and so much of it coming back to what we think and feel about the world and our place in it, and emotions. And I think Gail is so spot on that we just don't talk about that enough, this basic stuff of how do I feel about the world? How do I feel about my life? Never mind acting in accordance with my values if I feel shit about everything. So this stuff really does matter. Thank you, Gail, for coming on. And as I said a couple of times in that record, bloody hell, Gail, thank you for your tenacity as we grappled through Riverside FM being a little bit of a shitbag. I'll be back soon with another episode. Please do give me a review. Please do spread the words. Tell your friends about this show. Contact me at hello@yourbrainonclimate.com and consider chucking me a couple of quid on the Patreon at Your Brain on Climate. Means the world. Thank you so much. Brilliant chat. Brilliant to bring it to you. Love you very much. I'll be back soon. Okay, bye.